Let's begin this more in-depth look at these four fundamental benefits of creating and consuming arguments by starting off looking at presentation, and specifically really presentation that intends to persuade. So really the first two benefits. And we can see how arguments facilitate this by thinking about how difficult it is for us to gather information, organize it, and see relationships in real time. So arguments specifically set out to organize information in a manner that minimizes the challenges, the very real challenges, to processing large and complex bodies of information that humans face. So arguments organize information. They try to provide a model or a roadmap for an inference. They explicitly point out bits of information, and they try to explicitly relate that information to a conclusion. So they model this relationship between evidence and conclusion, between reasons and the sort of conclusion one might draw on the basis of those reasons. And they work very hard to do so in a way that minimizes the information overload that can quite easily occur when we start to process relatively large or complex bodies of information. And you might think, oh, you're overstating our limitations, Dr. Wallace, but in fact it's not the case at all. Here's a nice example from popular culture of the limitations of our human ability to process information and see complex relationships in real time. So this is a picture that I pulled off the internet from a series of books called Where's Waldo? And somewhere in this picture there is a Waldo. Waldo has a very specific way of dressing and looking and should be easy to identify, and yet when you look at this picture there is so much information. There are so many relationships between individuals and elements of the scene and so on that you cannot simply see. You cannot just extract that information immediately out of the presentation. There's just way too much information for your working memory or your conscious awareness to extract the stuff that you need right from it right away. And arguments try to work to create a presentation of information where the information is already structured in a way that shows you its relationship to other bits of information, that makes it clear what the arguer is trying to establish and why. Now, that's not to say that arguments are always successful. So this individual down the corner here is Charles Ludwig Dodson, and he is also known as Lewis Carroll. He wrote Alice in Wonderland, for instance. But he was also a mathematician and a logician, and he was sort of infamous for having examples or problems in his logic text of arguments that were good arguments. If the evidence, the premises were true, the conclusion absolutely had to be true as well. They really did establish that relationship, and yet there wasn't obvious at all how that relationship was established or what relationship was established and so on. So here's an example from his textbook of one of those arguments that's deliberately convoluted and hard to understand and follow. Animals are always mortally offended if I fail to notice them. The only animals that belong to me are in that field. No animal can guess a conundrum unless it has been properly trained in a board school. None of the animals in that field are badgers. When an animal is mortally offended, it always rushes about wildly and howls. I never notice any animal unless it belongs to me. No animal that has been properly trained in a board school ever rushes about wildly and howls. Now, I've gone through those 7 premises, those 7 reasons in Carroll's argument here, and yet by the time I got to the end, you were probably like, I have no idea what has to be true given these 7 bits of information. I'm not even sure what those 7 bits of information were anymore. But in fact, it is the case that no badger can guess a conundrum. is a statement that has to be true if those top 7 statements are all true themselves. It is a good argument. It would establish that last sentence, no badger can guess a conundrum. But it's presented in a way that doesn't help us to identify the individual content elements, see their relationship, so that we can understand the relationship between the premises and the conclusion and see how the premises of the evidence supports the conclusion. It's not a good roadmap. It's not a good model. And Dodson used to give these arguments to his students to get them to try and restructure things so that they were good arguments, so that they did facilitate presentation and they did facilitate persuasion. The next feature of arguments is that notion of persuasion. So arguments don't just show you a relationship between the premises, the initial information, and the conclusion. A good argument can establish that relationship in a way that has normative force. And that is in that last argument by Lewis Carroll. If the premises were true, whenever those premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. So if you accept the reasons, the premises in a good argument, and it's a good argument, then you have to accept the conclusion as well. And if you don't, you're demonstrably incorrect. We can show why it is that you're wrong about that. And that gives us a certain normative force. It gives us a certain sort of conventional means by which to say, no, you're being, say, irrational in not accepting that. The last 2 features that we want to look at are preservation and evaluation. And they both have to do with preserving a line of thought and refining and evaluating that line of thought once preserved. And this is particularly true of written arguments, though oral arguments can serve this function as well. So when we rehearse an argument orally, we write it down somewhere, we transfer that information from our working memory, from our conscious awareness, to an external long-term memory, like a piece of paper or a computer memory, or in older times, a piece of papyrus or a clay tablet. And this transfer allows for greater permanence of the modeled inferences, and that facilitates preservation. So you can go to the library, check out books written by ancient Greek philosophers like Plato, open up a page and see their thinking preserved across all those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. So facilitates preservation. But it also allows us, once preserved, to go back and evaluate that argument. Are those reasons sufficient to establish the conclusion? Is there a shorter way, a better way? Do I need to modify my argument? And so they allow for us to reformulate, to reevaluate, and to create a better argument, in addition to allowing us to preserve a line of thought. And in doing so, this allows us to refine and make our thinking more sophisticated than it might be otherwise.